Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian Process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftists and grassroots forces. And on this week's program, we have a very special episode where we're going to be wrapping up everything that happened in Venezuela in 2024 and taking a look at what's going to happen in 2025. And on this occasion, as you can see, the whole team is here. The editorial team of Venezuelanalysis has come together to have this conversation with everybody here, all our viewers and listeners. And we're basically going to be covering domestic issues, the situation around the election, which was obviously the big story this year in Venezuela. It largely dominated our coverage. As I was preparing this episode, I was looking through all of our old articles, and I was like, wow, we talked a lot about the election before, during, and after. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Obviously, it's one of those things that, whereas usually maybe the world's attention is elsewhere, it became focused on Venezuela, and there's obviously a lot of implications as a result of that. And then finally, we're going to be wrapping up with a conversation around foreign policy. I think Venezuela's place in the world is actually much larger than I think a lot of people appreciate. And I think in particular with what's happening in Palestine, Venezuela's been playing a leading role. So it'd be good to wrap up this conversation about Venezuela's place in the world. And of course, everything that is going to play out next year. So I wanted to start with a conversation around Venezuela's economy. And I think I'll start with you, Ricardo, as you've done a lot of coverage of this issue in particular, particularly around the oil industry. It's actually one of those issues that I think a lot of the readers of Venezuelanalysis and the supporters of our media outlet are most curious about. One of the advantages is that all three of you are based in Venezuela. You're on the ground. You live these realities. Ricardo, I think I'll start with you. If you could talk to us about the situation on the ground inside of Venezuela, but also bringing in that element of Venezuela and its oil policy. We've obviously seen a lot of developments around that. Ricardo, where is Venezuela at today in terms of its economic output, the situation on the ground, given the realities that the country is facing right now?
Hi, Jose Luis, and hi everyone. Hi to our viewers. It's great to be here. Sometimes reality is so hectic in Venezuela that we never take the time to do these kind of recaps and taking stock of everything that's happened. But yeah, I mean, the year began when we were in the middle of this temporary sanctions waiver, and it actually turned out to be really temporary, General License 44, which the Biden administration issued in late 2023, and then withdrew in April 2024 over these repetitive allegations of non-democratic compliance, to put it very shortly. But basically, sanctions remain the name of the game, and they remain kind of an all-encompassing factor affecting all of Venezuelan reality. And when we talk about the economy, it always begins in the oil industry. No matter how optimistic or how wishful thinking we may want to sound when it comes to overcoming dependency on oil, the economy still moves at the rhythm of the oil industry. And so when this license was removed, it essentially meant that Venezuela could no longer sell oil freely. It again had to resort to these intermediaries. There was only one corporation that got a license to buy crude directly. That was Reliance from India, and then there was also a slight fall in Venezuela's oil prices, and of course that affects the budget significantly. And going forward, I'm not going to jump ahead of myself because I know we're going to discuss what Trump can entail for Venezuela, but we've discussed it before. We've discussed it in podcasts. I know Andrein also wrote a column about this. What can we expect? Is it a return of the maximum pressure? And if that's the case, is the Venezuelan economy and the oil industry in a better situation to resist right now than it was before? In some ways, yes, and in others, maybe not so much. But the oil industry is kind of stagnated, and it cannot really move forward as long as sanctions are in place. These major investments that are required to do some kind of qualitative jump to really take production over 1 million barrels a day or over 1.5 million barrels a day, that's not going to come as long as there's this permanent threat of secondary sanctions. And in fact, even the government kind of recognizes, because it put forward the budget for next year, and it actually has a smaller reliance on oil revenues than this year's budget. So it means that they are kind of preparing for different scenarios, and then perhaps whatever increased oil revenue comes can be taken as some kind of extraordinary revenue and be applied in a different way. And as for the economy on the ground, I mean, here the other people who are in Caracas can also share their own impressions. There's a bit of a tense calm right now. I mean, we've lived through the past 5 years. We know it's nothing compared to 2018, 2019, when it came to this constant struggle and instability on a daily basis. But there are some signs of a tense equilibrium that's being strained further and further, and one of the symptoms of that is the increase in the exchange rate. So there's this parallel exchange rate that has no correlation to reality, but it's used by retailers to set prices. It's used by the major players in the economy to boost their profit margins. And because the recent path in terms of dealing with sanctions has been to loosen regulation, the Venezuelan central bank has kind of surrendered control on forex controls, and so it struggles to bring this issue under wraps, and of course it has implications for inflation. So right now there is some kind of effort to deal with this without setting off another inflationary spiral. But it's clear that these business sectors, the Venezuelan bourgeoisie, who has historically been hostile to the Bolivarian Revolution, and then in recent years they have also been hard hit by sanctions, and they came to some kind of economic peace. But that doesn't mean that they're still not going to use any and all mechanisms available to push their profit margins. So essentially, it is a balancing act that the Venezuelan government has been doing, with a lot of influence from these external factors, and of course sanctions chief among them.
Yeah, of course, I think we can't overstate the role of sanctions and how much it has, for lack of a better word, distorted the Venezuelan economy and forced these kinds of accommodations with certain interests of capital, which have similarly been affected by that. But I think it would be also really useful to have a conversation about the alternatives, right? This is still a revolutionary project. There are still acts of self-determination happening, particularly inside of the territories, in the communes. And Cira Pascual Marquina is, of course, also joining us, and she has done an incredible amount of work directly with the communards, with different organizations who are doing this work. And I was hoping you could talk to us about how that is also proceeding. So, we understand that the government is restrained in terms of its ability to, make the kinds of investments that it maybe wants to as a result of sanctions, of unilateral coercive measures. But there's still this very rich, vibrant, exciting experience happening on the ground in the territory. Cira, could you talk to us about some of that in terms of how they are finding solutions to the challenges that are presented by the present circumstances in Venezuela?
So if we look at the past few years, I think we do have to contextualize when we talk about communes, and it is indeed very important, and I'm grateful that you bring it onto the table, Jose Luis. When you think about the past few years in terms of the coercive measures, what's very interesting is that it actually was in the worst of times when communes began to reemerge. It was around 2016, 17, 18, when communes, while Chavez had promoted them since 2009, it was around those years, in the times of the nothing, la nada, which kind of like reverberated with that commune or nothing, comuna or nada of Chavez, that communes began to reemerge. But actually that was a very difficult time. Many people were focused on solving their individual problems, and also because of the pressure, because of the sanctions, because of U.S. imperialism, actually the government had to make certain concessions in terms of liberalizing the economy. It has been only, I would say, in the last couple of years, and specifically in the last year, that this movement that is robust, that promotes self-organization, democratic reorganization of the economy and of society as a whole. I would say that it's only in the last year to year and a half that we have seen a virtuous kind of like meeting again of the communal movement and the government policies. Of course, not only have I visited many communes, I am a communard, and as such, we are always demanding more, because actually to make communes in a world that is capitalist, you actually need resources. So we are demanding more. But actually, we have seen a tangible, a real shift towards the communes in the past couple of years, and specifically in the past year. So there have been consults that have been promoted from the government, in which communes and future communes, spaces that could become communes, have been able to decide collectively, democratically, via assemblies and then via the vote, what projects will be prioritized to solve the problems that we face at the communal level. And there have been two such consults. They have been very interesting because they are consults in which the people actually decide, like there are limited resources. It is true. It is no secret that there are very limited resources. And when the people are able to take decisions in terms of how to channel those resources, that is extremely effective in terms of solving problems, and it is also a motor for the self-organization of communes that are not so robust or that are beginning to organize and to build self-governments in the territory. So I think that it's very important to look at this year as a year of a shift. Some people may have doubts. Some people say, oh, this is a pragmatic decision on the part of the government. It doesn't matter to us. To us communards, what matters is that there is a space in which we can advance towards a communal project, and it is up to us, of course, up to the communal movement to actually advance in this context. For us, this is a very positive moment, but it is also a time of challenges, and the challenges are on us. The challenges are to actually be able to not only maintain and grow the communes that actually exist, but to grow the communal movement. Because the truth is that maybe 10% of the country is actually organized in communes, and we have to go towards 100% of the country being organized in communes. So that is the challenge that we face for next year.
So you brought up an interesting point. I wanted to ask you, Andreina, who's also joining us here on the program, Andreina Chavez, staff writer of Venezuelanalysis, around this dance, right? Around the fact that this year, I think more so in other years, we saw the emergence of these interactions between the popular power, between the communes, between the grassroots forces, and the government, right? We saw these special processes to decide how to spend these resources, but we also saw, for example, very recently this month, the election of these kind of special jueces de paz, right? Which are based in the communes as well. What do you make of that? How do you explain this relationship, this dialectic that exists between constituted power and popular power in Venezuela?
Well, thank you, Jose Luis. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting analysis that we could make. And I'm sure that Sira and Ricardo probably will have something to say about it too. Well, to be honest with you, the way I see it, the Chavista people, Chavista organizations in Venezuela, they have understood better than anyone, and in many instances even better than the government itself, how important the Bolivarian project is and how important it is in the face of an imperial power constantly targeting us and trying to destroy this project, which means that it is actually a project that it is a barrier, it is something that contains imperialism in the region. It makes sure that imperialism doesn't turn Latin America into its backyard, into its neo-colonial playground or something like that. So the Venezuelan people has truly understood that. And in these times of adversities, when U.S. sanctions, wrongly called sanctions, because we know that they are unilateral coercive measures, they are collective punishments, not sanctions. In those times when the Chavista people when the Venezuelan people were going through all these difficult economic circumstances, when our lavish projects were stolen from us, because we have to remember that people need to create lives, they need to create a project for themselves, and this was something that was stolen from the Venezuelan people during these times of crisis. And the Chavista people and Chavista organizations like communes especially, they sort of saw this as an opportunity to say, you know what, since you are attacking us more than ever, and since we know that our project is something that it is valuable because you want to destroy it, we are going to become stronger, we're going to organize more, we're going to be the ones who bring solutions to people's daily problems in their houses, in their communities. We're going to be the ones who are going to make sure that we reach food sovereignty. We're going to be the ones who make sure that people are getting medicine, all these problems that the commune and popular organizations sort of took over. And it was impossible, I believe, for the government to not see that, just like Chavez said, the future of Venezuela and the future of socialism in Venezuela and the future of the Bolivarian project was in the commune, was in popular organization, was in giving more and more power to the people. So I think there was a moment when there was sort of like this synergia, something clicked there. And then suddenly we saw that the commune was finally given the protagonic role that it was always meant to have. Because we knew right when Chavez started talking about the commune, and in the months before he passed away, we knew that that was the future, and people already had understood that. But because of all of the adversities that Venezuela went through, because let's face it, it's not easy to be a government, a head of government, and to have the biggest empire in the world against you, always trying to overthrow you. So yeah, there are some sort of discrepancies and sort of setbacks that we saw during these years. But thankfully, like Sira said, I think this is the year where we're finally seeing that shift. We're finally seeing that coalition between government and commune, government and popular power. And a proof of that is what you were saying, these elections that are going to happen every 4 months, and people are going to decide, they're going to vote to decide on local projects that the government is going to fund. But the people are going to carry it. The people are going to make it happen. And then we have this election of peace judges where people are also going to choose their own mediators, someone from their own community to solve the problems from their own community. And I think as time goes on, in the next 6 years, that we have in this next government that is going to start on January 10, I think we're going to see a radicalization of the Bolivarian project. And I think that is thanks to how communes and how popular power demonstrated that they really were the future of Venezuela.
If I can just add something, to complement what Sira and Andreina said, I think one thing that I would recommend is that people look at a lot of the content that we've produced in recent years, precisely documenting and showcasing this resistance from popular organizations in the worst times of the Venezuelan crisis. I mean, it would have been natural, quote unquote, to expect them to, just fade along with the very difficult economic situation. But, as both Sira and Andreina pointed out, it was actually the opposite, and it was precisely a product of all the politicization and the confidence in the socialist horizon that the communards refused to just fade away, and they reorganized and they found new ways to resist. So there's a long series of interviews that's ongoing that Sira has produced by visiting the territories, as well as a lot of other content that we've produced. This year we did a video on the Communard Union, which is not the only one, but it's certainly one of the most interesting organizations around in Venezuela right now. And one small item that I'll bring up is the appointment of Angel Prado as Minister of Communes earlier this year. I think that's kind of a result of the strengthening of the communal movement. And one of the things that he used to say in the speeches that he gave, both after he took office and later, is that there is this tension, this constant tension in the Venezuelan economy because of the external pressures. And so he was saying it is up to popular power and to communes to showcase that they can actually produce an alternative model, and by doing that they will have a bigger weight and a bigger influence in how the economic policy goes. I think I agree that the national consultations are a tremendous step forward and a leap, a qualitative leap. But in terms of resources, that's still a very small amount. I mean, the 4 consultations a year would amount to some $180 million. So it's also down to the communes to, as Angel Prado was saying, to showcase that they can actually do more. And also, I mean, the consultations are not the only sources of funding, but essentially showcase that by having this grassroots democracy, by having better process of accountability, by prioritizing the needs of the community, they actually offer a better response in economic difficulties than expecting some kind of capitalist normalization through the private sector driving the economy out of these difficulties.
To borrow some of the language of Angel Prado, talking about their responsibility to show something. I think as a anti-imperialist media outlet, it's our responsibility to showcase these voices. And I'm so incredibly proud to be able to work with all of you here to be able to get those voices out. I have to admit, Sira, I even had a little a pang of jealousy when you said I'm a communard. I wish I could say something like that. I wish things were at that degree here, but it's certainly where we should be paying a lot of attention. And of course, I would be amiss if I didn't mention that we are in the midst of our fundraiser right now. So if you're watching and listening to this program and you're able to support the work of Venezuelanalysis, support our on-the-ground coverage, please subscribe, donate to the Venezuelanalysis website. You can find out information on the website right now, venezuelanalysis.com. And speaking of Venezuelanalysis and our anti-imperialist mission, of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the elections. This was the major news item. Like I said, in fact, I was looking through all of our coverage over the past year, even going back into the December of last year, where we were talking about everything kind of leading up. I want to remind everybody that obviously there was a temporary slight reprieve of U.S. sanctions on the oil and gold industries in Venezuela ahead of the elections. Now, we don't really have time to get into it in this episode, but it's worth remembering, right? This was the Biden Democratic White House. At the time, it was led by an individual named Juan Gonzalez, who had the file on Latin America, and he was always pushing this line, we can use sanctions to get what we want out of Venezuela. And ultimately, an agreement was struck with the opposition, with the Washington-backed opposition in particular, the one that had so often boycotted, refused to participate in elections, finally agreeing. But then, to fast forward a little bit, we saw that the U.S., in its imperialist arrogance, decided that they were not satisfied with what Venezuela had done, accusing them of not keeping to the agreement, saying nothing about all of the failures of the, radical hardline opposition and its inability to respect democratic rule of law in Venezuela. But ultimately, we saw a bit of a walkback, right? That same reprieve of sanctions was rolled back in a lot of ways, to send a message, right? Nonetheless, Venezuelan institutions are the only ones that matter in this case, right? And Venezuela's institutions held up the ban of Maria Corina Machado, right? And the opposition was forced to respond, putting in the stand-in candidate Edmundo Gonzalez. So in the lead up to the election, what we saw was basically two competing camps. Obviously, there was a very long list of candidates, but it boiled down to the revolutionary forces, the Bolivarian forces, supporting Nicolás Maduro in his re-election attempt, and the reactionary forces, the very fascist-adjacent forces, the stand-in candidate for Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo Gonzalez. And then, as we know, the result of the election, July 28th, we see Nicolás Maduro be declared the winner by Venezuela's institutions. And here's where I want everyone to jump in if we can, because I think it's actually really worth repeating. We did a lot of coverage, a lot of stuff that was happening in the moment, but now that we've had some time to digest it, I'd love to hear from all three of you around what it was like to be in Venezuela in those days following. So, we see the announcement, Nicolás Maduro reelected to a 6-year term. And of course, the opposition did not recognize the results. They refused, as they always have every time they've lost, to recognize the results. And there was a really kind of tense moment there. In the immediate days in particular, those 2 days following the election, what were you feeling? What was it like to be in Caracas on those days on the face of what looked like it was going to shape up to be yet another experience of violent rebellion by a small fragment of the population, acting in the interests of imperialism, acting in the interests of reaction to try to affect the result and declare it null? We'll start with you, Sir.
So basically what happened on those following days was not a surprise. We all expected it. They were telegraphing it. They were telegraphing it that they were not going to recognize, and they were also telegraphing that there was going to be trouble in the streets. Maria Corina Machado and her puppet, basically, at least her, we know very little about him, but she is a fascist. She's a fascist, and it's that simple. And of course, a fascist with the backing of the U.S. empire. So what happened those days couldn't surprise anybody. It was, however, very concerning. immediately, immediately on those days, the following day, I had to move through the city, and I had to go through barricades. So a comrade came to pick me up and on a moto, and we had to go literally through some burning tires. That was the 29th. So those days were very, very intense. It wasn't a surprise for us one, because they were telegraphing it, and two, because we have had other moments of fascist violence, such as 2017, happen in Venezuela. There was an action. There were specific situations that were a little bit different from earlier guarimbas, in the sense that they were able to mobilize certain working class, small fractions of the working class, which had not happened in the 2017 events. So that was a little bit different. But basically, what we saw is that they tried to take over the streets with barricades, with burning tires, putting trash in the streets. And also, it wasn't just that. I think it's very important that we are able to report on events that are kind of very tangible from Venezuelanalysis, but all of us who are connected to the grassroots movement, everybody got threats under WhatsApp groups, which is what Venezuela moves itself with in terms of communication. There were so many threats to Chavistas. There was so much violence in this context that this is something that's not told, and it's very important to relate it. Fortunately, the government was able to act quickly, and the response was effective. Of course, I am a communist. I do not particularly enjoy state repression, but it was needed in this context. And it was needed, and it lasted basically 3 days. At least in Caracas, the situation of tension lasted 3 days, and it was a victory. It was a collective victory to be able to do this in such a brief time, because in 2017 we spent months with the fascists on the streets, and of course nobody wants that.
Yeah, so if I can just jump in and add something to what Sira was saying. So, first, the thing is, Venezuela has elections, and it's like, we have elections today and we don't really just move on. There's always the exterior world always wants to always have us stay in this constant state of defending this, or trying to defend our sovereignty in the final election, we can't really just have a normal election like anybody else. It's always this constant pressure that's why we feel like we live the elections for months. It's not just one day. And about the post-electoral protest that we saw, well, I do remember that the next day after the elections, I looked down my window and I saw these people, these men holding guns, and they were shouting some bad words against the government. And I was like, damn it, again, because I've lived this twice now, in 2014, in 2017. And in those years, the violence in the street it lasted for months, and it was truly traumatizing. I do remember instances in which I had to cross these barricadas, and I would be held at gunpoint, asking where I was going. I had to lie. I had to say I'm going to the hospital, I'm going to visit my mom. I couldn't say that I was going to work because I worked in Telesur, so it would have made me a target. I couldn't use my identification because using the identification will mean that you could be targeted. And so I lived through that for months, not to mention the fact that my community, the community where I lived back then in 2017, it was completely taken over by these violent protesters. And for 3 months, I basically couldn't sleep in my own bed. I had to sleep at the office because I couldn't get home. The few times that I tried to go home, there were several attempts to attack us. There was one time we were in the car and we heard all these gunshots. They were trying to warn us not to continue. So we had to drive back to where I was working. And so I remember all of that, and I was like, damn it, this cannot happen again. It cannot be that we have elections and that I'm all for people protesting if they are disagree with the results. and all of that, but planifying all this violence, because we know that it was planified. We know that the opposition was months before the elections already saying that if Maduro was declared the winner, no matter the vote count, they were going to take the streets, they were going to protest, they were not going to accept the results. So we knew that this was planified in many ways. So my first thought was, damn it, this cannot happen again. We have to be able to contain this violence, especially because, as Sira said, there's people, working class people, people in general, who did join this protest, and many of them were not expecting this, to be in the same place as these people who had these violent intentions, who were there to destroy public property. We know that we saw many buildings of popular organizations being destroyed. We saw statues of Hugo Chavez being taken down. We saw 2 Chavista women, popular organizers, who were murdered in this. They were killed during this protest. So we know that there's people who might have gone out to protest and they got entangled in these violent activities. And to be honest, for me, the fact that the government this time responded so quickly and so strongly, I think it makes sense. It was necessary at the moment not to let this fascist violence to take over our streets, to take over our lives, to stay out there for months, destroying people's lives. We know that in the past years, 2014 and 2017, a lot of people died simply because they couldn't get to the hospital because their lungs were blood or something like that. So we knew that this couldn't happen again. We couldn't really go through all that suffering again. And so I think the government response was quite quick and quite strong. I do know that, like I said, a lot of people might have gotten arrested just by being in the wrong place, being entangled in these violent groups. And I'm glad that so far we have seen that the judicial authority has released at least more than half of the people who were detained during the following days of the election. And I think that has been the right thing to do. We know that many of them committed minor crimes. We know that many of them might still face trial, but I think it's a good thing that the judicial authorities are responding to these issues by accelerating this judicial process and making sure that innocent people, maybe even young people, minors who are involved in these things, can receive some accelerated process so they don't have to stay in jail for a huge amount of time. And I think that's the right thing to do. About the election itself, like you were saying, it is the most important news in Venezuela. And it is the most important news because we saw an electoral national authority give an official result, declaring that Maduro won the election with 6.4 million votes, and saying that in second place came the opposition candidate, the US-backed candidate, and like Cira said, the puppet of Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo Gonzalez. He came in second place with, I think, 5.3 million votes. And so we saw the official results. After that, we saw that the opposition, as we already knew, didn't recognize the official results. And instead, they say that they had informally collected all of these tallies, and these tallies gave the victory to Edmundo Gonzalez. Of course, because we know that Venezuela cannot have any kind of doubts in these matters, there was a judicial process to ratify the electoral results. So we saw the electoral authority deliver all of the evidence of the electoral results to the Supreme Court. We saw all of the candidates that participated in the elections also bring all the tallies that they had individually collected during the election. And we saw a process of ratification of the electoral results. And you will think, well, this means that if Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado were so secure about the fact that they won the election, why didn't they provide all the evidence that they did when they had a legal channel to do it? And they didn't. They chose to not go to the authorities to prove their electoral victory, and they decided to rely on the backing of Washington, the backing of Europe. the scenario that we're facing right now, is that come January 10, we have a president that is in Venezuela, something quite important if you want to be the president of a country. And we have another one that is in Spain that voluntarily went to Spain. And he even signed an agreement before leaving saying that he respected the electoral result. He respected the fact that the Supreme Court had a ruling that declared that the electoral result was valid. And he left to Spain. And now we are seeing the same person, Edmundo González, in some sort of tour around Europe, saying that he's going to somehow, in some way, because he doesn't really clarify if he's going to be in Venezuela or not, somehow he's going to proclaim himself president of Venezuela come January 10. So that's the scenario that we're facing. We are very soon to be on the day that Maduro is going to officially take power for a new 6-year mandate. And what we are assuming that is going to happen is that Edmundo González is either going to be in some country in Latin America, maybe Chile, maybe Argentina, maybe he'll go to the US, and he will do the self-proclamation as president in one of those countries. So that's the scenario that we're facing, which is crazy. I think it's insane that we're once again having to deal with the fact that we have an outsider, someone who didn't win the popular vote, declaring himself president, just like Juan Guaido did it. And we know what that means. We know that this means that all of the assets that Venezuela got stolen or frozen by Washington is now going to be in the hands of these people. It's now going to be in the hands of Edmundo González, of Maria Corina Machado, the same way it was in the hands of Juan Guaido and his people. And we're going to see again the resources that belong to the Venezuelan people being used by them for their political campaigns, for their tours around Europe and Latin America. So this is the scenario that Venezuela is facing now. This is why I say that Venezuela doesn't just have election. We have election, and it's like a forever event. It doesn't really end.
You know, it's extraordinary the way that when it comes to Venezuela, it seems like things literally repeat, right? It makes me think of the famous phrase, first as tragedy, then as farce. But you both made a really interesting point. I wanted to point our viewers and listeners to an article by one of our columnists, Glorvaldo Hernández, where he says, Maduro, an expert in defense and counterattack. And that piece actually touched on a couple of things that you mentioned about the need to actually respond to this, right? The state has the legitimacy to respond to these kinds of insurrectionary actions. And I know that's uncomfortable. But maybe you should feel a little bit uncomfortable. You should have to actually face this. You know, we all want to, sunshine and rainbows and a perfect revolution. Those things don't exist. You're a fool if you think that is. And it requires this kind of actual intervention. Ricardo, I wanted to ask you before we move on to our final topic in terms of, Venezuela and the world, around the opposition's response in all of this. Andrina obviously touched on a lot of things, but, right now we don't even know where Maria Corina Machado is. They hold these demonstrations and barely anybody shows up, right? I think Andrina made a really good point in saying, well, if you thought you won, where's your proof? I mean, that's really one of the things that I always mention when people ask me. I'm like, well, if they were so confident, they had these tallies, why didn't they present them? And so the opposition didn't. Now we see Edmundo González in self-imposed exile. We should highlight that, right? He wasn't kicked out. He decided to leave with the approval of Spain and Venezuela, who reached this agreement. But again, like I said, what do you make of the opposition's response to the post-July 28th scenario? And then, we can get into kind of what that'll imply for regional relations.
Yeah, I think you kind of said it in the introduction. I mean, the Venezuelan institutions, acting in these special circumstances and under all these external threats, solved addressed the issues at hand, and essentially the Supreme Court said, these are the results, and that's the end of it, and that's all for now. Touching back on something that both Sir and Andreina brought up, it did. I mean, the post-electoral scene did harken back to these very extended periods of street violence from 2014 to 2017. But I think there are also significant differences, and one of them was the inability to actually sustain them over a long period. And I think that goes to show two things. I mean, on one hand, the lack of stomach from the opposition's own support base to maintain any kind of extended insurrectionary periods, But also, I mean, just the mere lack of capability to maintain any kind of street presence, and the opposition, Maria Corina Machado essentially took the reins after she no longer had to pretend that she wasn't in charge, and she called for successive demonstrations, and they dwindled in size, and I mean they were always in these Eastern Caracas strongholds until they got to a point where it was so small that she didn't even go out to talk to the crowds, and that's when the rumors of where she was started. I don't know if she's here or abroad. I mean, she's just disappeared from the public scene, and right now it's clear. I mean, now she's come back with some social media messages. I mean, every Sunday she comes down from the proverbial Twitter mountain with a message, and she has these very prophetic messages that the end is near and fear should fear us, very, very metaphorical. I don't know what to make of them. But it's clear that they don't really know where they're going. They don't have the force. And the fact that there is a transition going on in the US also makes it harder because, I mean, not jumping ahead of ourselves, it's not clear how the Trump administration is going to handle this. And so they basically want to create some sort of instability. We might see these kind of low-level sabotage attacks to disrupt the electric grid or something like that in the lead up to January 10. But I mean, there's no clear way forward, neither in terms of support within the military nor in terms of street presence. And that's why we saw Maria Corina Machado kind of backtrack and say, oh, the end is near, but it might not be January 10. It might be later. So they are, I mean, as always, they are in the hands. The decision making is not up to them. And so because precisely of that, I mean, we can place our bets here on the table. I don't expect Edmundo to proclaim himself and to have some sort of inauguration abroad for different reasons. I mean, I might be wrong. It's not that these things always follow the most rational or reasonable path. But I think because they are in the hands of the foreign sponsors, I think that limits the possibilities for the foreign sponsors to create this kind of apparatus. I mean, the assets are already stolen and frozen. I mean, the US State Department and Treasury Department can do whatever they want with them. So they might not want to tie themselves to a specific apparatus with all this circus and also expose themselves to ridicule. I mean, Guaido was dangerous and nefarious for a lot of reasons, but it also provided us with a lot of amusement. So I mean, again, this is my expectations just based on several factors. I don't see the Trump administration going down the same path, even though, I mean, all the possibilities on the table for the Trump administration are bad, but I wouldn't bet on a repeat of the parallel government. And also, I mean, just to repeat my own point, because the opposition doesn't seem to have any strength, not that Guaido had the strength, but he at least had some presence to the point where their own deluded selves could pitch to Washington that they had the capacity to overthrow the government. Of course, they were nowhere near the capacity. But now it's even worse, so it's even harder a case to pitch. Of course, it depends on who's making the decisions and how high they are on their own supply, on their own US exceptionally supply. But I don't see a parallel government. I do see, and this is something we've discussed amongst the team in recent years, kind of a generation of different points of pressure. So one of them is Guyana and these very close relations to the US Southern Command. These days there were some very weird stories coming out of Trinidad over, again, some already existing agreements with the US Southern Command, but a renewal, and some newspaper opened the possibility that Trinidad could host US troops in case of a quote-unquote Venezuela conflict. It's all very loose and not really based on anything solid, but it goes to show how the U.S. foreign policy apparatus wants to create these sources of pressure, both in direct terms, in terms of a military threat, but also maintaining this economic pressure via sanctions.
So you made a really good point there, which is that the decision isn't necessarily in their hands. It's in the hands of U.S. imperialism. So let's do a really quick recap in terms of the response by Washington to the election. So we saw them echo the comments of the opposition, giving voice to these claims of fraud. Then we saw Blinken say the night of the election, or very shortly thereafter, say, oh no, Edmundo Gonzalez is the president-elect. And then State Department kind of walks it back and says, no, we're not ready to do that. But then again, during the G20 on the sidelines. Apparently Blinken was going around telling everybody, no, we're going to start calling Edmundo Gonzalez the president-elect, and that's kind of where we are now. So we heard a little bit from Ricardo in terms of what he thinks U.S. imperialism is going to do in this window, and it's kind of weird because officially the new term begins January 10th, and in the US it starts on January 20th. And so in a lot of ways, who's actually going to make the decision on January 20th? It's still going to be the Democrats, but who's going to have to actually follow up on it? Well, it's going to be the Republicans under Trump, right? So maybe they'll go a different tack, or maybe they'll continue with the bipartisan imperialist consensus when it comes to Venezuela and largely have the same policies. We'll see. So I want to hear, we'll start with Andreina. What do you think in terms of the U.S. response in this context come 2025 when it comes to Venezuela and its president?
So like you said, where we are right now is that we do have the State Secretary Blinken. He now recognizes Edmundo Gonzalez as president-elect. And we also saw that the European Union has also come forward and recognized Gonzalez as president-elect. And so that sort of gives me the clue that the Biden administration, as he's now leaving office, is trying to sort of set the stakes for trying to do what they haven't done, which is to fully recognize Edmundo and which is to support a future self-proclamation as president of Venezuela. Of course, like you said, like Ricardo was saying, it could also be that that doesn't happen. It could also be that that doesn't happen in January, but it happens further down the line when the U.S. has probably more clarity on what they are going to do regarding Venezuela. Everything we've heard about from Trump right now, from Donald Trump, is that he's going to deport as many Venezuelans as he can. He believes that every Venezuelan in the U.S. is a criminal. He's going to deport everybody, and that's basically his Venezuelan approach right now. He was also saying very recently, I think it was yesterday, that he... And again, this is in alignment with the Biden government. This is the thing that I enjoy the most about U.S. imperialism, how much they pretend to hate each other, but how much they are exactly the same, especially when it comes to foreign policy. So the Biden administration is already considering not renewing these oil licenses that they have given to all these corporations like Chevron, like Electoral, and many others, in order for them to commercialize Venezuelan oil. So it's already considering the fact that they are not going to renew these licenses. I mean, at least Blinken said something on the, like, it's all on the table. Like, we're considering everything right. And Trump was just saying yesterday that they are considering not buying any more oil from Venezuela. So more or less, you can see how they are aligning the strategies that they have regarding Venezuela, so there can be like a perfect continuity when it comes to Biden, to Trump, and when it comes to Venezuela. And so what I believe that is going to happen, I do think that at some point the U.S. is going to try to continue supporting or advancing the figure of Edmundo Gonzalez, because that's all they have, really. That's all the opposition have. This figure that, if we have to emphasize it, a figure that does not have popular support. Like we saw this in the mobilizations after the elections when Maria Corina Machado tried to mobilize people, tried to bring people to the street to sort of demonstrate that, look at all these people who are supporting the candidate that won the election according to her, and to try to prove all of this popular support. And she failed completely and entirely. We saw even media who supports the opposition, they couldn't hide the fact that these concentrations were a complete failure, and they showed that they do not have the popular support. So again, I think that even though that's the reality, I think that the only card that they have right now is this fantasy that they can proclaim someone president, and somehow, somewhere, they're going to find a way to remove Maduro from power, remove Chavismo from power, and place this figure in Venezuela as president. So I think that's the only card that the U.S. has right now. I think the fact that they're going to maybe not renew the licenses to Chevron and all of these corporations is not something that is a surprise. And I bet that the Venezuelan government was probably expecting that to happen any moment. So I think that's why, as Ricardo was saying earlier, I think that's why we see the budget for the presupuesto, yeah, the budget for 2025 in Venezuela is not depending on oil income. And I think that, I mean, of course, how can it depend from something that is constantly under U.S. Aggression? You cannot. So I think this most likely the Venezuelan government was already expecting this to happen. And I think the most difficult circumstances that we're going to face right now is the fact that all of these Venezuelan migrants are going to face really hard circumstances now that they're going to be criminalized and they're going to be deported and probably separated from their families. And I think that's going to be the most devastated aspect of the next government, of the next U.S. government.
So I think that Andrina basically outlined something that's important. They cannot turn their back in terms of the elections, and they are going to continue to maintain that line. So that is going to be one piece in how the U.S. is going to operate in something that's going to be yet again, and if it never changed, it's going to be maximum pressure. Like they bring it up again, but it's always been since the beginning of the sanctions maximum pressure. And I would say it's always been maximum pressure since the Bolivarian Revolution began some 25 years ago. So there's that, but I think we can also expect, and this should be of concern to any anti-imperialist, like any anti-imperialist has to, really stand with the Venezuelan people, with the decisions of its institutions. Anything else is not anti-imperialism. But then people also have to be aware that there are going to be irregular military incursions in Venezuela. I think that it would be wonderful if that didn't happen. But the most likely thing is that we will see irregular military incursions. I think we are going to see that they are going to try to generate a lot of distress via the frontiers. We have seen kind of like some small attempts in recent past, and of course in 2019 too. We have seen some what I think were small attempts. We will see more of that. And I think that this actually should call for a robust solidarity with the Bolivarian process. I mean, a solidarity that's not yes, but. It's a solidarity that is all with. That's a kind of solidarity that sovereign people who are building a different, an alternative, an anti-capitalist, and of course anti-imperialist revolution deserve. This is key. So these are the kind of like the coming months and years. This is what what we can expect to see. Of course, the thing that happened in Syria, the recent events in Syria are also part of the reorganization of Southcom in recent weeks. So right now, Southcom is coming more overtly around us. Not like it hasn't always been around us. Like Colombia, 7 imperialist bases in Colombia. But we have seen in the past few weeks actually a very overt declarations that they are here and that they are around us. Now again, I actually really don't think that we are going to see U.S. military actually come into our territory, but they are trying to generate a situation, like of pressure, also military pressure that would lead in their kind of like very incapable capacity to predict what's going to happen here, that will lead the government to make a concession to them. That is actually not going to happen, fortunately, but because it's not going to happen, the violence and the aggression against the Venezuelan people, against the people who are trying to build a sovereign project, is going to grow more and more over the next few years.
Before we wrap up, I did want to pose a question to you, Ricardo, about Venezuela and its neighbors. Because actually one of the things that we saw in this development, we always saw the right-wing countries playing imperialism's games. But we did see in this instance unfortunate positions from virtually all of Venezuela's neighbors. We did see Mexico take a better position respecting Venezuelan sovereignty, but we saw Petro in Colombia and Lula in Brazil take some unfortunate positions on that. So in the context of this, of the looming threats that Cira just described, that Andreina described for us, What do you make of the relationship of Venezuela with its neighbors today going into 2025?
Yeah, I think it was tense for a bit, and then I'm not going to say they came to their senses, but they kind of walked it back a little bit. Petro said a few weeks ago when he was in Brazil that he had been a proponent of Venezuela holding elections, but he now realizes it was not the right thing to do because, as long as there are sanctions, then, there's no possibility of having a free and fair vote. I'm paraphrasing. You can look up his interview with Global for the exact quote. And the same with Lula, who was very invested, and basically they were nitpicking at the kind of difference from past elections in that the National Electoral Council did not publish the broken down results by voting center. But of course, it's not for any foreign government to be satisfied by electoral results. So, in that sense, they overreached in the stance that they took after the election, and then it kind of took a while, and it was a lot of back and forth until they kind of came to their senses, or at least assumed a more reasonable position. But even during the, let's say, the most belligerent, not belligerent, but for this context of friendly relations with Brazil and Colombia, they always affirmed that the diplomatic relations were something between states, and so that was not going to change. And I think that ties to the broader context that Ciro was bringing up in terms of Southcom, and what you're also mentioning. When we had the right-wing governments and the Lima group, I think the climate has changed in Latin America, and there's really no appetite for any kind of broader instability, which of course is not going to stop Washington from pushing it. And in that sense, Trump is more of a wild card because he doesn't really believe in anything, and so he might just launch into some adventure like he did when he ordered the assassination of Soleimani. And so, in that sense, what Ciro was saying of having of a solidarity movement, and also here in Venezuela, people being ready, is certainly something to highlight. And finally, on the Syria parallels, we saw a lot of the opposition kind of celebrated as if that was, and also, it should be said that the fall of the Syrian government, no matter what we thought of it, is a significant setback for resistance and for the axis of resistance. It's a significant setback for the Palestinian cause. But the parallels here with Venezuela don't really go beyond wishful thinking, because basically the opposition does not have anything remotely resembling Al-Qaeda in terms of actually being able to do anything on the ground. They cannot even gather a few thousand people in their eastern stronghold. So, having this idea that they're going to make the government and the army collapse is a fantasy, which of course does not mean that there's not going to be an effort coming, mostly from the outside and from the U.S. Southern Command as kind of the beachhead here in Latin America. So, if we're starting to wrap up, I think we are looking at further years of tension. We can debate on what's maximum pressure or not. I used to joke that Biden took maximum pressure to 95% pressure. I think that's going to kind of stay there. There were some policy proposals of America First sanctions policy, so basically leveraging sanctions to increase U.S. dominance over the Venezuelan energy sector. It's something that, Trump's statements are always a lot of bluster. So he used to say, we could have taken all the Venezuelan oil. And he also wants to deport people, what Andreina was saying before, because of all this stigmatization and racism that's deeply built into Trump and to his campaign. So if he wants to deport people, like it or not, he has to deal with the Maduro government. And so in that sense, of course, they're not going to drop the electoral issue. They're going to keep saying that Edmundo Gonzalez was the victor. But to go from there to actually proclaim again, of course, it's not unseen, and it's certainly a possibility. But I think they might want to keep their options open for now, in the sense that it could bring them more benefit.
And before we close, I do want to pick up something that Ciro said earlier, which is that we shouldn't put conditions on our solidarity, and we shouldn't expect people to be able to freely condition their solidarity. In fact, it's very important to express it freely, completely, in the way that Venezuela has with Palestine. And I wanted to end on that and really highlight the cause of humanity in this moment. We do it in every podcast episode. We do it as much as possible, but I did want to end on this and also highlight the way that Venezuela has been a steadfast ally of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian resistance, Even just recently in the ALBA summit, there was a special declaration made by the ALBA countries around Palestine. And so I wanted to take a moment to say that that is a good example of what solidarity looks like. You can have your disagreements with this or that individual thing. We might have our disagreements with Hezbollah or Hamas, but we understand that they are the resistance, and our solidarity is with them. And I wanted to give you a chance for everybody to also maybe in this last minute to say their words about the importance of solidarity in the context of Palestine, but also in the context of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process.
So I actually was in the ALBA TCP summit, and in the days prior, there was also a social movements ALBA kind of like meeting, and it was a very interesting space. I think it's important to think about that because we are actually going on 20 years of ALBA and on 30 years of something really extraordinary that happened, which is the meeting of Chavez and Fidel. So I think that when we look towards the future, we also have to look towards a history of construction that, of course, Latin American integration is difficult to build, and it's difficult to build when your supposed allies like Lula turn out to be really pretty much mediocre. But still, Latin American integration is one of the lights, one of the key elements in the Bolivarian process. And also it has to be done, and it is being done with the movements, with the social movements, which are participating. I mean, I was participating as a communard. I was participating in the summit. So there were dozens of people from social movements and communes who participated in the summit. I think this is important because it actually gives you a light of a world that doesn't divide, the institution from the actual spaces of popular construction. And I think this is important everywhere. I mean, I'm saying something very, very simple. Of course, we have a terrible situation in many ways, but we also have a privileged situation in Venezuela because we have a government that, one can criticize it, of course, but we have a government that is actually with the grassroots people, with the grassroots organization, and that is actually what is key. And then the Venezuelan people, we will solve the problems that we have, which are many, and we will solve them best, of course, without U.S. interventionism, without U.S. imperialism. So for all who are listening to us, I guess I would say, of course, advance in your territories, do what you are doing best in your territories, in your organizations, and so on. That's the most important thing for any revolution. But also, really commit to bringing down this siege on Venezuela that is really brutal, it's really bloody, and it has to stop.
So I just want to add really something there. Sira was mentioning the ALBA summit, and I was just reading the declaration, and they integrated Palestine into ALBA. And they also said in the declaration that in the future, when Palestine is free, there's going to be a summit of ALBA in Palestinian territory. And I thought that was so beautiful. And I thought that sort of summarized so well how close Venezuela and Palestine are, not geographically, but when it comes to how they are together in this fight against imperialism, in this fight for self-determination, for sovereignty, for a socialist future. And quite recently, Leila Khaled, a legendary Palestinian fighter, was here in Venezuela, and she visited a Venezuelan commune in Caracas, which is actually the commune where Sira belongs to. And she was saying that she was praising the fact that these communards had the chance to create this space of self-government, to make decisions on the ground about how they wanted their lives to be, about how they wanted their communities to prosper, making decisions about their own destiny. And she was praising that and saying that I do hope that one day Palestine gets to do the same. And that moment for me was absolutely beautiful because I just thought, oh wow, I mean, communes in Venezuela are not just these things that are happening that we see as something that in the future might become something bigger. No, they're basically the personification of what resistant U.S. imperialism is. They are the personification of what it means to create a dignified future for the people. And they are a personification of what Palestine is fighting for. So to me, that sort of summarizes how well Palestine and Venezuela are together in this fight, and how there are two pillars that everybody has to defend, everybody has to protect, because these are sort of like the pillars that are holding together this solidarity and between the peoples and this constant struggle to overcome the Zionist and the imperialist aggression against our people.
Yeah, there's not much to add. Of course, Palestine is the issue, and I mean, a lot of the other issues in the Middle East are related to Palestine, and so I certainly join everyone in hoping that Palestine will be free. But just picking up on the final thing that Andreina was saying, I mean, basically everything else is already said. When we talk about, why is the imperialist onslaught against Venezuela so unceasing, and the first answer is always oil. It's the oil, stupid. And here are the world's largest oil reserves. But much bigger than that and much more dangerous than that is the creation of not just an alternative project, but a revolutionary project here. And one that, as we discussed earlier in the show, even in the worst conditions, refused to surrender and refused to give up on the socialist horizon. And that's really the biggest threat to US hegemony, not just in this hemisphere, but also around the world. And so my advice to everyone who is listening, beyond echoing the calls for maintaining unconditional solidarity with all those resisting imperialism, is to organize to resist imperialism within your own context, but also find a way to link directly to, for example, organize delegations to Venezuela. Those are always super helpful in terms of creating these direct links and these direct solidarity relations, and really understanding the process from within. It's not just about coming here to get a recipe that you can reciprocate, but you can replicate. But understanding how these processes emerge, and they're always very, very enriching experiences. And of course, coming back to us, stay tuned to Venezuelanalysis. Support us if you can, because we are always constantly documenting these efforts to resist imperialism, denounce the devastating effects of imperialism against the country, and also the grassroots resistance that stands up even in the worst of circumstances.
We too here at Venezuelanalysis, we refuse to give up. We refuse to give in to imperialism, and that's why it's important for you to support our work. As I mentioned, we are in the midst of our year-end fundraiser, so if you're able to, please consider donating, becoming a subscriber, increasing your subscription if you already are, or become a supporter of the podcast directly through Patreon. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and of course, special thanks to Cira Pascual Marquina, Ricardo Vaz, and Andreina Chavez, the staff of the editorial team over at Venezuelanalysis, for this year-end wrap-up. As always, it's going to be an exciting year, and we'll be there to bring you coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. Thanks so much for joining us.